So, our first question actually is what the heck is anthropology? What am I doing here? What class is this? Why am I here? Actually, they call this chapter Why Anthropology, but we really should know what we're talking about here. It's actually too huge. Yeah, they give this idea that anthropology is the study of what it means to be human in the broadest possible sense way out there. This is like a huge academic discipline. And in fact, as you just quoted, it's like past, present, future, which sounds pretty odd. Later on in the summary for this chapter, they'll say it's all places and times. Talk about huge. Humans in all places and times. And I think this is important for us to start out with, in part because there has been, or I would say, the discipline of anthropology emerged in a context of Europeans and North Americans who were reluctant to consider other people human in other times and places. Now, this could just be known to us as straight up racism, but it's the idea that other people might be not quite as human as you are. And so anthropology has always insisted that people in all places and times are equally part of the human family. And in fact, anthropology even has asked or broadened our perspective on what is human at all, right? And that's part of the thing about anthropology is one time you're studying these little things like teeth, and the next thing you know, you're asking these big questions about, well, what is a human anyway? Now, they start off the chapter by talking to us about hominins, that a human is part of a group of creatures that are upright walking primates. Now, we'll talk a lot more about this later when we talk about human evolution and biological anthropology. I just want to give us a preview, a scope of what we're talking about when we talk about human beings. So hominins are upright walking primates, and human beings are members of this larger family of bipedal, upright walking primates. That's part of our definition. So this goes back a long, long time ago to what we call the most recent common ancestor. That's to say 6 to 8 million years ago, maybe 8 to 10 million years ago. Things get iffy at that time when you're talking millions of years. There was a divergence between the kinds of creatures that would lead up to, say, chimpanzees of today and the creatures that started to become habitually bipedal. And so that was the most recent common ancestor between, say, today's gorillas and chimpanzees and bonobos and human beings is 6 to 8 million years ago. So that's where we'll be starting in human evolution through the Australopiths, who are much more assuredly bipedal, walking around, upright walking primates. You may have heard of one of them. The most famous skeletal example of this was called Lucy, about 2.5 million years ago or so. And so now we have more definitive upright walking primates through Homo erectus, you may have heard. Now, this name, Homo erectus, comes from the idea of being walking. And so this was named because they thought it was the first example of an upright walking primate. In fact, it was not, but the name has stuck. So that's from about 2 million years ago, Homo erectus, who are creatures that might be within the range of looking like us in terms of their height and gait and what they could do with their bodies. You may have heard about Neandertals. If you're really up on your science, you might have heard about Denisovans, Homo naledi, creatures that were around 100,000 years ago. Now, here's the catch. None of these species, subspecies are around anymore. You may think you've encountered a Neanderthal, but you haven't. They're gone. They disappeared. And so we, Homo sapiens, are actually the only surviving species of this much larger and more diverse collection of creatures. We're the last ones left. And so we are a species of hominins, but these other species, which we would include in the hominin family, include in our family, are not here anymore. Now, we don't necessarily want to call all these past creatures humans. There's debate about how far we want to extend the term human back. We can certainly say that all the people, the upright walking primates, all the Homo sapiens that we say today are equally within the human family. There are no subdivisions, no subspecies that are of any consequence to our lives. We are the Homo sapiens, the last surviving species of hominins, and anthropology is the discipline that studies all of us in every time and place. Now, that is too big. It's too big of an academic discipline. It's too huge. And so anthropologists generally have divided themselves up into 4 subfields. So you have your biological anthropologists, archaeologists, your cultural anthropologists, and your linguistic anthropologists. And then your textbook has this neat little graphic how they all study their own thing, but there's this overlap there about what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human? The meaning of our lives in general. We'll just go through each of these in order today, and as we go along in our class, we'll basically be covering each of these subfields in this order. Biological anthropology, as we've been talking about, one of its main subjects is that of human evolution. Obviously, if we're talking about human evolution, we're going to be talking about biological diversity among human beings, but biological anthropologists also talk about present biological variability among humans. Again, there are no separate species of Homo sapiens or subspecies or subgroups which have any huge differences that matter that much, but there is biological diversity among human beings. We are biologically varied in all kinds of different ways we'll talk about. They just don't group up into our usual things. It also includes what we call primatology, which is the study of non-human primates. We're included in the primate category. We'll talk about this. Linnaeus did that to us. But yes, we are primates. We didn't evolve from primates. We are primates. Remember, we're one of the family of upright walking primates. Now, archaeology is basically the study of the human past. What people did in past times. You're looking at the stuff that is left over, what we call material remains, and you're also looking at artifacts. Everybody loves artifacts, the stuff that people made or used in the past and is available for our help here. Bless you. They discuss what is called the archaeological record. So we'll talk about the fossil record, which is what has been left over from the creatures that lived in the past, but the archaeological record is all the evidence that we have of past human activity. We're talking about artifacts, stuff that was built, plant and animal remains, all that stuff is potentially fodder for archaeology. Even if I convince all of you to be archaeologists, hundreds of people to be archaeologists and go out there and study archaeology, why are we only probably going to get a small glimpse into what people were doing, say, 1,000 years ago? Only so much can be preserved. Most of the stuff we make goes away. It goes away in a few hours, let alone 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. Most of the stuff is gone. It's not here anymore. Those built structures fade into the ground. You don't see them anymore. The plants take over the sidewalks, and the next thing you know, you don't have any sidewalks anymore. So most of the stuff, a lot of evidence goes away. But there's another thing as you dig up an artifact. Let's say, I don't know if any of you have seen this. Sometimes they have these funny things where they show the archaeologists of the future digging up the rim of a toilet or something, and they surmise that that person has worn this as a headband or something like that, right? So the thing is, it's also very difficult to say what an artifact means in context from 5 or 10,000 years ago. So even if we had all the stuff, it is a question of interpretation. Now, we can combine archaeology with the biological stuff and with contemporary cultural anthropology to kind of get more of a sense of what might have been going on. But yeah, there's a lot of missing stuff, like the fossils too. We're not going to find that many, really. All right. Cultural anthropology is actually the largest subfield in US anthropology. As they put it, it's the study of how people share, change, and dispute. Very important because people in the same society don't all think the same. Dispute culture within a society. Now, this definition is a little bit circular, saying that cultural anthropologists study culture. So we have to figure out what culture is. Again, that's a pretty complicated question we'll be talking about. For now, I want to talk mostly about the culture as a collection of norms and symbols. Norms are just belief about what is acceptable. They call it a shared belief about what is acceptable. Remember, though, that there's a lot of dispute. A lot of people argue about what is acceptable, and not everybody believes the same things are acceptable in the same society. And certainly between societies, people have different norms. And then we get the example of a wedding ring. Something that might be just an object, but in a particular society, it might have a meaning. In our society, putting a little band around your fourth left-hand finger means you're married. When I was doing my fieldwork in South America and Colombia, they actually wore that little band, or some of the people did, on their right hand. And when I was younger, my wedding band didn't fit on my left hand very well. It was too slippery and slidey, so I put it on my right hand like the people in Colombia were doing. And I thought, this is good. And then you get back to the United States. I don't know if this is still true, but in the olden days in the United States, what did it mean for a man to wear a silver band on the fourth finger of his right hand? No, maybe this isn't true anymore. You were in a gay marriage. So it can mean different things based on your social context. And Colombia didn't mean that. It was just that's where they wore it. But say it's the same symbol, I mean, it's the same object, but we can interpret it in different ways. Now, actually, what's another example? We can all recognize it and know what it means. It's just a 7, but we could have written some other thing there. So these norms and symbols get so ingrained in us. As you put it, we don't even think about it anymore. They become completely natural to us. And so we navigate through society and see all these things and take them in a symbolic way, but they actually come to us from, and this is hugely important, from learning what they mean. So the same object or the same scribble or the same piece of cloth can mean very different things in a different cultural context. And so what anthropology does is show us how in our own society and other societies, we learn how to recognize certain symbols. And we learn them so well that they become second nature to us. It feels completely natural. But in fact, these are all things that are deeply learned in our society. They talk a little bit here, but we'll talk about that in chapter 2, about how anthropology is done, cultural anthropology, that is. So they talk about ethnography, which is literally from the writing about people, but it's where a person will go off who wants to be an anthropologist and immerse themselves in another society so that that person is then basically doing the data collection and analyzing it as what we call participant observation. And so it's not the same as doing, I mean, you might do a survey and you might do interviews and you might talk to people, but you're also just trying to live with them and get their own sense of what these things mean in their lives by participating in their activities. There's a word that anthropologists use a lot for this. One of the things that we'll talk about is the importance of field work. That is getting out of the academic book learning sphere and actually doing things in outside of that is hugely important for anthropology, for all the subfields of anthropology, but it's particularly associated with being a cultural anthropologist, going to a different place, either another society or a place within your own society, and trying to immerse yourself as much as possible in the lives of the people that are there. Our fourth subfield, which some of you liked, it seemed, it's called linguistic anthropology. Basically, in some ways, it's allied to cultural anthropology, but it's specifically a study of human language in social context. Language is the most important symbol-based system learned and used by humans. So as we just heard, the number 7, there's no reason that that symbol 7 represents something that we all understand. So language is based on a whole bunch of words and sounds, which are not necessarily associated with that. There's no natural reason why we call a dog and not a perro or a chien or a hund or all those things that we hear from different languages. There's all these kinds of symbols that we associate with things. But a couple of you like this quote. Language is one of the most amazing things that humans do, that we can communicate based on symbols, and there's so many different types and so many different kinds, and that's a pretty fascinating field. Also I would say one of the more complicated or dense subfields, in part because to study language, you have to invent what we call a meta language to talk about language in the abstract, and so it can be pretty difficult to read. This is the anthropologist who appears in your text, Jonathan Rosa. He's probably one of our coolest anthropologists because you can barely see where he is. There he is fading in with the students there, but he was studying in the Chicago area, and I assigned his book once, and it was extremely hard to read, but he was studying how different uses of professionalization, rhetoric in these schools, and trying to get people to talk in certain ways, and how the students were manipulating that for their own, or navigating that world. But like I said, he's one of our cooler linguistic anthropologists. I always have loved this tweet from him. So I don't know if any of you have been criticized for saying the word ask in a different way, but as Rosa says, basically, that's not a big deal. It's just a linguistic phenomenon called metathesis. Told you it was complicated, but it's not a big deal. And if you get criticized for that, it's basically racism in general and anti-Blackness in particular, because these forms shift all the time. One of our cooler anthropologists. The text talks about the major subfields, but there are other specializations in anthropology. Some people like to combine biological anthropology with archaeology, and so they'll do a bioarchaeology class. Or we also have people who combine various subfields in order to do medical anthropology class. Another course you can take in the spring if you're really into these kinds of things. We won't spend a lot of time because anthropologists tend to get super specialized in these kinds of things, but that's what happens. Toward the end of this chapter, they start using something that we might not have thought about before to talk about how each of these subfields would approach this. Different things people do with their teeth. Some people have whiten their teeth to an extreme extent. Some people darken their teeth. Some people put different things on their teeth. Now, if you're a cultural anthropologist, a couple of you talked about this. What might you do here as a cultural anthropologist? What might you be looking at? Not true. Yeah, we wouldn't necessarily think about this, but yeah, our teeth are particularly visible, and people do all kinds of modification on them to to do different things with them. And of course, in linguistic anthropology, you might talk about how people use their teeth to create different kinds of sounds, which, if we're not trained in that particular society to hear those sounds, we might not associate them with social meaning. You had an example of this. What is it? The tooth suck. Yeah, I don't know if I can do this, but yeah, you make a sound with your teeth, and then it's used in order to convey, especially in certain West African and Caribbean societies, used to convey displeasure or anger. But if I heard it, I don't know what I might think. I might not think anything at all. So people use their teeth and mouths to use sounds which, if you're raised in that language, you can hear them, but if you're not, you may not be able to differentiate them. There are, for example, languages in which the meanings can change on whether you are breathing out or sucking air in. And unless you've grown up with that, it's hard to learn. You can do it over time because we're flexible, but it's easier if you were raised in that language. Archaeologists, what can we do with teeth in archaeology? It may be a very narrow window onto the past, but you can get some clues about what people were eating, their diet, their health, from their teeth. And it's also true that, as some of you may know, teeth are some of the things that most preserve. So your all of the rest of your skeleton might disappear, but your teeth will be around perhaps a little bit longer. So often it's the one thing we have to look upon. And also in biological anthropology, you look at these teeth to talk about how primates might have diverse diets. Yes. So that's one thing you can do. And then another interesting little point here, which I hadn't thought about either. It seems like primates of similar body sizes across males and females tend to be more pair bonding over time than others that are more promiscuous if there's larger differences in body size. By the way, humans are on the very not much difference in body size. Some gorilla or baboons groups, for example, the males are twice as large as females on average. That's nowhere near. Human beings are like 5 to 10% difference on average. But yeah, it's an interesting thought about teeth.